God, thank you so much for this morning. Thank you that we're all here. God, there's a lot that could have distracted us or put us on the sidelines and said, I just can't be here today. But I believe there's a reason why we are here. And I don't want that to be missed on any of us. God, I want ultimately Jesus to be at the center stage, and I want him to get the attention here. Because ultimately I don't have anything that is going to change us. I don't have anything that is going to just click and make everything in our lives magically better. But ultimately, God, I believe that if our hearts are soft, as we sang in that song, if our hearts are humble before you, you are going to draw near to us, and we are going to experience you on a real, relational, personal level like we've never experienced you before. And I'm convinced of that because you are in the business of transforming lives. You are in the business of showing love to every single one of us. And so, Father, I want that to really happen here this morning. Again, not because of what I have, not because of what I've prepared, not because of anything else. But God, I ask that you would have already primed us to be able to hear from you and to see you clearly and to see you only. Have everything else just get stripped away so that something of significance can happen. In your name we pray. Amen. Like I said, we've been going through a series called From Eternity into Eternity. And the whole idea of this series, as we kind of look at this wall, is to look at the big picture of the Bible, to look at it from beginning to end so that we have a kind of a clearer picture of what's going on here. But I'm going to ask you some questions because I love interaction and I love engagement with this type of stuff. But how many of you, whether by a yes or raise of hand, like some sort of consistency in your life?
Yes.
Okay. Anyone on the flip side, we're not going to call you out and judge you too much, but who likes lack of structure? Anyone like chaos? A little bit of both? Okay. And I would agree with that. There's some things where I want freedom. I want to be able to just do my own thing. But I am glad that there's things like gravity. I am glad that there are things like air. I am glad that there are things that I can count on. And I'm glad that there is some sort of consistency. And consistency in our world sometimes is what kind of gives us some sort of foundation for the reality that we are living in. What we are going to see today is that the consistency that we are going to see in this part of the story in the Bible is a consistency that has started from practically the beginning and has gone all the way till now, but it's a consistency that we really don't want to have any part of. Because as we look at our wall, we started off in saying God is enough. Without us, without creation, without the world, anything, God was enough. God created, and everything he created was good. And then last week we looked and said, it broke. It was broken. And I, to the chagrin of some of you, have brought a new vase. And what we saw last week is that even in God's good and perfect creation, that at some point Adam and Eve decided, it's not quite what I wanted it to be. And so they decided to sin. And in sin, and in their rebellion against God's plan,
you know what he's going to do? No.
They broke God's plan. And instead of being able to experience this goodness and experience everything that God had planned for them, they were now living in a broken world. And as much as they would have liked to say, I'm going to go back and fix this, I'm going to go put this back together, they couldn't. And instead they were living in this world, in this place, even up till now, where we're still living in a broken spot. We're still living from brokenness. And what we're going to see today is a very clear kind of a flow of events that we have to understand. And I need your engagement with this because ultimately 3 things came out of the world being broken. First thing is sin is brokenness. We have to understand that sin equates to brokenness every single time. Brokenness always results in death. And death in the Bible, when we read the word death, it always ends in separation. So I want your engagement with this. I want you to fill in the blank with those orange words. And I want you to kind of get these in your mind. And we're going to come back to this over and over again today. Sin is what?
Brokenness.
Brokenness. Brokenness always ends in death. and death is
Separation.
Those are the three components. And what we're going to do today is really, we are going to see two accounts. And I believe that these are historical, literal accounts in the Bible, in the early parts of the Bible in Genesis, where we are going to see examples of this over and over again. And that consistency back then is going to flow into even where we're at today. So if you've got a Bible, I'd encourage you to turn over there with me. But Genesis, at the very beginning of your Bible, Genesis chapter 6, we're going to see example after example of where brokenness leads us. And the brokenness that is displayed in Genesis chapter 6 is displayed in Noah's generation. Noah's generation. If you look at the account of Noah, Noah is going to be found in Genesis 5 through Genesis 9. If you want to read his whole story and his whole biography, that's where you'd find it. But for today, what I want us to realize is the brokenness that is displayed in his generation is very relatable to the brokenness that we see still today. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 and 6 is where we'll start. It says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness," that word wickedness in the Hebrew is really interesting because it's translated so many times. Wickedness is used so many times in so many different kind of flavors. Wickedness is translated as bad 23 times, evil 148 times, and then ugly 6 times, and then sad 4 times. There's this overarching feel to this word wickedness of bad, ugly, sad, evil. Like it's an ugly, like filled type of an idea. He says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil." That's the exact same word as wickedness. It's repeated there again. "And it was wicked continually." There's this common theme that once the world was broken, it continued to be broken up until Noah's generation. And it was wicked everywhere. It was broken everywhere. Keep going in verse 11 and 12. It says, "Now the earth was corrupt." That word corrupt means to go to ruin. It's on a path to, as AC/DC said, highway to hell, right? Like it's just, that's where it's going. "Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence." That's like an action word. To be violent or to treat violently or to treat wrongly is the idea there. In verse 12, it says, "God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt." Again, the same word, corrupt, go to ruin. "For all flesh had corrupted," or gone to ruin, "their way upon the earth." Man, that's a happy message, right? Like that's the culture, that's the generation that Noah is living in, and is broken. Based on these verses, I want you to kind of do some word association with me. Based on these verses, a culture that is that kind of wicked and evil and corrupt, what is that? Fill in the blank there. A culture that is corrupt does. A culture that is corrupt is. Or
Self-seeking.
Self-seeking, yeah. Okay. What else?
Selfish.
Selfish. There's a very what I want, when I want it. Like it's me. What?
Brutal.
Brutal.
Scary.
Scary. Unsafe. Yeah.
Revels and lies.
Revels and lies.
Damaging.
Damaging.
Tiring.
What'd you say?
Tiring.
Tiring.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. There's no rest. Yeah.
Prideful.
Prideful. Those are the words that kind of fill in what is happening in Noah's day. This is the brokenness that is happening. That it is everywhere, a culture that is corrupt. And I look at that, and one of the things that, and Nicole mentioned it, one of the things that popped up in my head was lies. Like at some point you've got to lie that I am the most important. Or that I can do this to somebody else and nobody is going to care. Like there is a lie that is believed and acted upon in a culture that looks like that. And I think today we live in a reality that is not only assumed, but is described here in Genesis chapter 6. There are some things that are healthy and some things that are going to corrode and die. That's just part of life. In Iowa, I experienced this every single year in every single way. As you're driving down the street, you would see car after car after car, and you would know whether it was a healthy car or an unhealthy car by the back fender of the car. For you guys that are from the Midwest, you understand this, that when they salt the snow every single year, eventually that salt eats and deteriorates and kills the metal and the fender that is around the car. And as it disintegrates, and as it literally like makes holes in the side of the car, you look at that car and you say, yeah, that car is going to die soon. Like that car is dying. And then you see the people that have upgraded and gotten new cars and they're like, yeah, they're healthy. Like they've got nice stuff. And you see these differences, and that's everywhere in our culture, is that we see the broken and we see the healthy. We see the corrupt, and then we see, hey, there should be something different. This isn't what we're aiming for. This isn't what we want. But the struggle in Noah's age and the struggle in ours is the constant proclamation that this is okay. That this is what the world is supposed to be like, that this is just fine. And I was looking in the news because honestly, the news has a lot of broken things that it proclaims. And so you look in the news, and I could give you time after time after time where we realize that there's a culture around us that is proclaiming and saying, you know, it's okay to be broken. It's just fine. And I'm just going to give you one because I don't think that it's really about the specific brokenness, but it is the fact to prove that our culture is somehow trying to digest that sin and brokenness is okay. The Washington Post ran a story from Lauren Rowella, and I'm going to try not to get into too many details, but I want you to understand the Washington Post is one of the probably 2 or 3 biggest newspapers in the nation. So this isn't something that's like, hey, some random little person. This is being proclaimed by Lauren Rowella, and it's about kink in pride parades. And I just want to read you one quote, and I just want you to understand what she's trying to say here. She said, "I never want my children to worry that exploring any aspect of consensual sex or touch is too taboo." I want to read that one more time, not because it's the topic, not because there's individuals, but just understand the idea that's behind this. I never want my children to worry that exploring any aspect of consensual sex or touch is too taboo. There's a proclamation, not just in this context, but in all sorts of contexts, that brokenness, that the sin that is in our world is the bad is good and good is everything. That it's just kind of accepted, that it's not that bad. It's okay for this to be okay. And when we look at Noah's generation, that was exactly what was happening. It's not that bad. Wickedness isn't that wrong. But here's the response that we see in Genesis chapter 6, verse 6. It says, "The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved," or pained, "in his heart." Just think about this with me. How did we go from getting a very good creation to going, God is pained over the brokenness that is in this world? God created something good, and then all of a sudden we have transitioned into God being pained. And the reason is that once you break something like this, it's not easy to go back to the pieces and put it back together the way that it's supposed to be. And in that, trying to get it back to where it was, we conclude that if we look at the display of brokenness in Noah's generation, that we conclude that Noah's generation and the world that he lived in was not good. It was not good. And maybe that's just oversimplifying it, but we have to understand that God made something good and it is now broken. Genesis 6:7, keep looking at this with me if you would. Genesis 6:7 says, "Then the Lord said, I will wipe out mankind, whom I have created from the face of the land, mankind and animals as well, and crawling things and the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. For after 7 more days," in Genesis 7, verse 4, he says, "For after 7 more days, a week from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made." there's a response from God to the brokenness that is in the world. And it goes into more depth in chapter 7, verse 17. He says, the flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth. And the ark floated on the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, or 22 feet deep. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind, everything on the dry land, in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. That's a reference back to Genesis chapter 2, when God created mankind in his image, and he said, I'm going to breathe into them, breathe into their nostrils the breath of life. That God has given this image, but then he is taking it away through death. Verse 23, he blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, they were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So we come back to this same idea. Sin is brokenness. Brokenness always ends in death. And death is separation. Another example, if you take your Bible and flip just a couple pages to the right in Genesis chapter 11, is another display of the brokenness, and brokenness is displayed during Babel's time. In chapter 11, verse 1 through 9, we see this account of the Tower of Babel. I'm going to just put an editor's note in here because this is going to be interesting. As we fill up this wall, as we go through this series, Babel, I want you to take note of Babel, because Babel is going to come back in a few thousand years through the nation of Babylon. And then at the very end of the Bible in Revelation, Babylon comes again. And so it's just kind of one of those things that's like we're starting at the very scratch, but we're going to see this kind of woven throughout the story. And I'm really excited about that. So that's my editor's note, but we're going to keep going. Genesis 11, 1 through 9 is this brokenness that happens in the culture of Babel in this time in Genesis 11. Genesis chapter 11, verse 1 says, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. I want you to kind of take my paraphrase and read into this verse as this. Language, at that point, is one of the few ways that the world has avoided brokenness up to this point. Like everything is breaking down. Sin is separating. Sin is producing death. But one of the few ways that humanity can say, hey, we've still got this together, everybody, is that everybody's speaking the same language and we're all on the same page. Verse 2. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar. The land of Shinar, that area is modern-day Baghdad. So if you ever want to visit the Tower of Babel area, take a trip to Iraq. I don't know if that's a good idea or not. But verse 3. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So in this one area that they could say that they hadn't been broken in, humanity aligns itself and unifies itself around it. And says, we're going to create this building. We are going to do this. And in fact, I think that in verse 3 and 4, what they're actually doing is producing and kind of creating one of the first world religions. They're saying, hey, we're going to unify and we're going to create something together. I'm going to ask you a question and get your feedback. When you think of religion, what is it? I mean, we can think of like, here's the title of religious groups, but when you think of what is religion, what do you think of?
You're worshiping some kind of deity.
Okay. A worship of some kind of god or deity.
Instructions on how to worship that deity.
Okay.
So specifically how you do it.
Rules and regs.
Rules and regs. Nice. You're so hip, Harold. Yeah, rules and regulations.
An attempt to fulfill a spiritual need.
Yeah. Some sort of like satisfaction within your soul, filling that hole.
Ideally, maybe bringing families together, communities together.
Yeah. Some sort of
No matter how that looks, you know.
some sort of community, some
Yeah.
sort of like bringing people together. Yeah.
Like, somewhat cult, like, it could be a cult that doesn't want it to.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like kind of it's getting people together in a way. It's like whether it's a cult or a religion, you're getting people together. I want you to look at this because in this next slide, I've just got something that hopefully you realize as you're reading through verse 2, 3, and 4 in Genesis 11. There's this little phrase in all four of these verses, and it is let us. Let us. On the left side in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 11:7, we see God said, let us. And then in verse 7, he says, come, let us go down. On the right side, what you see is come, and this is humanity talking, come, let us make bricks. In verse 4, come, let us build for ourselves a city. Let us make a name for ourselves. What they're doing is they're taking, here's what God has said and what he has created and what he has done. And they're saying, yeah, that was okay, but we're going to unify and we are going to do something together collectively. We are going to unify around something. And so in essence, what they have done is they have said, God, you're not enough, but we can fill in this gap. God, you're not quite there. I'm going to do it on my own. They have replaced God in this religion and said, instead of you being on the throne, ourselves are going to be on the throne. There is a swapping out of who is enough. Verses 5, keep going in chapter 11. Verse 5. And as you read verse 5, I don't think that you can put enough sass, salt, or sarcasm into this verse. Verse 5. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. So the Lord is sitting up there on the throne. He sees that humanity is kind of creating something for themselves, and he says, well, I better get up off my throne, come kind of take a peek down there, and see what these kids are doing. God, we're enough. And he's saying, what's going on down there? What's happening down there on the earth? We should probably check this out. I don't know what they're doing, but we should probably check. He's got to actually get off his throne to actually pay attention to what this little Babel thing is happening. That's kind of the idea and the connotation that is happening in verse 5, that the Lord has to get off his throne to see what is happening. And in verse 6, it says, and the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Understand, God is not intimidated by what the people in Babel are doing, but simply what he looks at, and he says, if I don't do something, they're going to continue with this lie of saying, we're enough, God's not enough, and they're going to continually go down this train track of brokenness to death to separation. And if I don't get involved, there's going to be a collision. There's going to be problems. And so out of his love, he says, I am going to come down and do something in order for this religion that is headed for bad things to be taken care of. Because ultimately, again, God says, no, I am enough, and you are broken. And so as we look at this kind of display of what is being said here, brokenness that is displayed in Babel's time, the conclusion of this is that people building Babel were not enough. The people during Noah's time were not good. The people during Babel's time were not enough. And I think I didn't plan this, I'm not this smart, but as I was going through this series, I'm thinking, okay, God in Genesis 1:1 is enough. God in Genesis 1 and 2, as he's creating something good. And then I go back and I look at these conclusions of these last two, and I'm like, everything God did we tried to usurp through our brokenness and try to do something outside of him, and it ends in the fact of we're still not enough and we're still not good. Our brokenness doesn't put us where we need to be. There's a response again by God in verse 7, in Genesis 11, verse 7. He says, "Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. The response then is the same, that sin is brokenness. Brokenness always results in death, and death is separation. God's response to Babel's generation follows the same heart-wrenching pattern of Genesis 6, that eventually God gets involved and he breaks up this brokenness that is happening within us. I want you to notice something about these two accounts, though, with Noah and with Babel. Like there's some similarities, but there's also some differences. The differences that I see is that in Noah's generation, we would look at them and say, like, they're the bad people. Like they're the wicked people that are over here. And then you look over here and you've got the religious people, the Babel people, and they've got the religion going on. And you've got both sides of it. And you say, well, I'm on the broken side, or I'm on the religious side. Like whatever side you're on, both of them lead to the exact same point. Both of them are leading us back to the same point where we're all still broken. You could be sitting here and you'd be like, I'm in church. I've been in church for decades. I'm on the religious side, and I'm not like them. They're awful. And then you can be on this side and say, well, those people are so hypocritical and judgy anyway. I don't want to be like them anyway. And we can be back and forth, but at the same time, we have to realize both of them lead to the same place where we are both broken. We're both in need. And I look at this, the place that they both get to is where we get to our big word for today, and the big word is consequence. Both of them lead us to the same spot, whether you're a religious person or whether you're a wicked person, whatever you want to put a title on. The word that we have to deal with is the fact that there are consequences on both sides. There are consequences for our brokenness. We know this by nature. Consequences are just a part of life. I've got kids, and they're trying to learn this a little bit, I hope. Consequences are a part of life, that eventually you understand that what you plant in your life is eventually going to reap into something that is going to come out of your life. Like if you put good things in, there's going to be some good things that are going to come out. If you put bad things in, there's going to be bad things that come out. Consequences are a part of life. And we see that, and we should recognize that, because as broken people, there are going to be broken consequences. There are going to be bad consequences, negative consequences that come in our life. And the question that I come up with at the end of this is man, Genesis 6, God, you flooded the whole world. In Babel, you separated humanity in this way. You kind of pushed people out. And then I look at my own life and I say, God, why do you allow the consequences that are in my life? Like, why? Like, that's the question that I have to ask. And the answer that I have for this, and I hope this is encouraging to you, the answer that I have is the reason God allows consequences in our life is because God is never passive. He is always proactive. Let me say that again. God is never passive. He is always proactive. Every single day, God is doing something in your life in order to show himself off to you, to show himself that I am here, that I am present, that I am doing something. And oftentimes I go through my days so quickly and so busy and so tired and so stressed out that I miss all of that. I'm thinking about tomorrow. I'm thinking about what happens if this doesn't happen. What happens if... And my mind is so actively on other things that God's like, I wanted to show that I was doing something in your life yesterday or the day before or today, and you totally missed out on it. I think one of the best cures to that is having other people in your life that are looking for that thing too. if I've got somebody else in my life that is trying to notice where is God working, and I sit down and I have a conversation and I say, hey, I don't see God anywhere. And they can look at me and say, well, that's not true. I saw him doing something like that in your life just yesterday. Or tell me about what's going on in your life. And even in the pain, even in the struggle, even in the stuff that we have going on, if you've got another person that is giving you some sort of feedback on your life, man, God's faithfulness, God's goodness is going to come up. And so I want to just leave you with 4 silver linings as we close today. 4 silver linings that I hope will encourage you that God is going to show up and show himself in your life. The first one, and we see these in these passages that we just looked at, is that God gives grace. God gives undeserved kindness in your life. He shows kindness to you even when you don't deserve it. Genesis 8:1, talking about Noah's life, it says, but God remembered Noah. All this is happening, all this brokenness, all the consequences, but God remembered Noah. Genesis 7:1 says, I have seen you, Noah. God is taking notice of what is happening in Noah's life, even when it feels like everything else is raining and pouring and nothing is going right. Genesis 6:8 says, but Noah found favor in God's sight. Noah experienced grace, even in the middle of brokenness, even in the middle of consequence. And any consequence in your life and in my life up to this point, even that has been by God's grace. He's not allowing difficult things into your life to push you away and say, I don't want to have anything to do with you. I mean, it's the same thing again with my kids. This is the best example. I don't give my kids consequences to say, hey, I never want to see you again. Stay in your room. No, I'm giving you consequences. God says, I'm giving you consequences even for your actions, not to push you away, but to draw you close. And he wants to show grace even in those things. The second silver lining is that God makes kept promises. God makes kept promises. In Genesis 9:13-16, we won't read it all, but it's after Noah gets off the ark, and God makes a promise to Noah. And he says, I have made an everlasting covenant with you that I'm not going to flood the earth again. And he puts a rainbow, a beautiful rainbow in the sky, and he says, this is a reminder to you that I'm not going to do this again. If for no other reason, maybe you don't read the Bible at all, but if you don't, I would encourage you, read the New Testament and look for promises in the New Testament. Because those promises that are in the New Testament are things that you should look at and say, I can believe these things and I can trust those promises because God makes promises and he keeps his promises. Third silver lining is God shows restraint. God shows restraint. Genesis 11:8, you look at the Tower of Babel and the people of Babel, and it says that he scattered them abroad. But I look at that, and even in that, God shows restraint because he could have sent them out and said, I'm going to create 9 billion different languages. Think about that. Each one of us could be speaking our own little language in our own little pod by ourselves. And God, even in the consequence of spreading them out with languages, said, I am going to allow you to be in groups. Even in the disunity and the death and separation relationally, I am going to allow you still to have togetherness to a certain extent. God's consequences, again, are not to crush us, but to reveal God is enough, God is good, and we need him. God shows restraint. The fourth and last silver lining is that God is thoughtful. God is thoughtful. In Genesis 11, verse 8, again with the Tower of Babel, God's consequences of separating the languages had his intended response. It says that they had stopped building the city. God gives a consequence with a thinking behind it. He's not like saying, hey, I'm just going to figure out a way to torture these people in the most sadistic way that I can. No, he's saying, how can I come up with a consequence that leads to the intended result? That instead of them building the city, hey, they're going to go back to me and say, I am enough. I am good. And my source of satisfaction in my life is going to come from God. It's not going to come from anything else. And so when God gives a consequence, he is doing it with thoughtful intention. God doesn't hate towers, but God is purposeful in what he is doing. He's purposely creating voids in our lives in your life in order to draw us back to Him. Because at the end of the day, we look at this and we say, sin is brokenness. Brokenness results in death, and death is separation. In Genesis 6, that separation was separation of physical life. In Genesis 11, it was a separation of relational interaction and relationship. But in both cases, those consequences were not meant to be an end in themselves. Those consequences, even those, were meant to fill us back up and say, we can go back to God, who is life and who is our togetherness. Or we can just sit and say, hey, consequences are terrible, aren't they? And we can just sit there. As I tell my kids over and over again, consequences are because I love you. It's not because I hate you. God is doing the same thing with us. These consequences in our life, the things that are broken, the things that we are dealing with in our world today, are not because God's looking at us and how can I make the world the worst place possible? Even today, He's looking at your life and my life and saying, I'm going to allow consequences, but those things are meant to draw you back to me. Where are you going to go?